The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Afghan mountains as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her pack for what seemed like the 100th time. At 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, she stood among her fellow soldiers like a sapling in a forest of oak trees. The other members of her unit towered over her, their gear making them appear even more imposing against the rocky landscape. Rodriguez had heard the whispers since joining the Special Operations Support Team 6 months ago. Some questioned whether someone her size could handle the physical demands of mountain warfare. Others wondered if she was just filling a quota, a token female presence in an otherwise all-male unit. But Rodriguez had something that couldn't be measured by height or weight. An iron will forged by years of proving herself in a military that had only recently opened combat roles to women. Born in a small Texas border town, Rodriguez grew up watching her father work double shifts at a factory while her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. She learned early that life didn't hand out participation trophies, and that respect had to be earned through sweat and determination. When she enlisted at 18, drill sergeants tried to break her spirit with extra push-ups and longer runs. Instead, she emerged stronger, more focused, and absolutely certain that she belonged in uniform. The mission briefing that morning was routine by special operations standards, but dangerous by any other measure. Intelligence had located a high-value target in a remote mountain village, and Rodriguez's unit would provide support for a Navy SEAL team conducting the primary assault. Her job was communications and medical support, roles that kept her close to the action, but theoretically away from direct combat. As the helicopters lifted off from the forward operating base, Rodriguez checked her equipment one final time. Her medical kit contained enough supplies to treat everything from minor cuts to life-threatening trauma. Her radio equipment would keep the team connected to headquarters and air support. She had trained for months to master both roles, often staying up late to study medical procedures and communication protocols while her male counterparts socialized or slept. The landscape below looked like another planet, all jagged peaks and deep valleys carved by millennia of wind and water. Afghanistan's mountains had swallowed armies throughout history, from Alexander the Great to the Soviet Union. Rodriguez understood the terrain's reputation for claiming soldiers who underestimated its harsh beauty and hidden dangers. The insertion went smoothly, with both helicopters touching down in a clearing 2 miles from the target village. Rodriguez felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as her boots hit the rocky ground. This was her element now, where months of training would be put to the ultimate test. The SEAL team moved with practiced precision, their gear and weapons marking them as elite warriors bred for exactly this type of mission. Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison stood out even among the SEALs. At 6 feet 4 inches tall with arms like tree trunks, he carried his equipment as if it weighed nothing. Rodriguez had worked with Morrison's team before and knew his reputation for bringing everyone home safely. He nodded respectfully when he saw her, one professional acknowledging another. The climb toward the village began immediately, following goat paths that seemed to disappear and reappear at random. Rodriguez settled into a steady rhythm, her shorter stride requiring more steps, but keeping pace with the larger men through superior conditioning. She had learned long ago that technique often mattered more than raw strength in mountain warfare. While others fought the terrain, she flowed with it, finding handholds and footing that others missed. 2 hours into the mission, the first signs of trouble appeared. Morrison's team reported movement in the village that didn't match their intelligence briefings. What was supposed to be a sleeping settlement showed signs of organized activity. Weapons glinted in windows, and figures moved with military precision rather than the random patterns of civilian life. Rodriguez monitored the radio traffic while keeping pace with her unit. The easy mission was becoming complicated, and complicated missions in Afghanistan's mountains had a way of turning deadly very quickly. She checked her medical supplies again, hoping she wouldn't need them, but knowing from experience that hope and preparation were entirely different things. The village perched on a narrow shelf of rock like an eagle's nest, accessible only by steep trails that left attackers exposed and vulnerable. As Morrison's SEAL team began their approach, enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. The supposed high-value target had been expecting them, turning what should have been a surprise raid into a carefully planned ambush. Rodriguez's unit took cover behind a rocky outcrop as bullets ricocheted off the stones around them. Her radio crackled with urgent voices as the SEAL team found themselves pinned down in the village's narrow streets. Morrison's calm voice cut through the chaos, calling for covering fire and medical support. 3 of his men were wounded, and extraction was impossible under the current enemy fire. The next few minutes unfolded like a deadly chess game, with both sides maneuvering for advantage on terrain that favored defense. Rodriguez coordinated air support requests while her unit laid down suppressing fire. Apache helicopters circled like angry wasps, but the enemy had chosen their positions well, using civilian structures and rocky overhangs to limit the aircraft's effectiveness. Then, Rodriguez heard the words that changed everything. Morrison was down. The SEAL team leader had taken a sniper's bullet while trying to reach one of his wounded men. His second-in-command reported that Morrison was alive, but unconscious, bleeding heavily from a head wound that required immediate medical attention. The team was trapped in a courtyard with no way to reach the landing zone for extraction. Rodriguez looked to her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Williams, a grizzled veteran whose weathered face had seen too many good soldiers die in places like this. Williams was already calculating odds and options, weighing the risks of a rescue attempt against the certainty of losing men if they stayed pinned down. Rodriguez knew what she had to do before Williams even gave the order. She volunteered immediately, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Someone had to reach Morrison and provide medical treatment before he bled out or went into shock. Someone had to help evacuate the wounded SEALs from their exposed position. Rodriguez was the team's medic, and, more importantly, she was the smallest member of the unit. She could move through the rocky terrain and narrow village streets with less chance of drawing enemy fire. Williams looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Rodriguez had trained for exactly this scenario, but training and reality were different beasts entirely. The lieutenant colonel nodded grimly, knowing that sometimes the smallest person had to carry the heaviest burden. Rodriguez checked her equipment one final time, securing her medical kit and ammunition. She was about to prove that heroism had nothing to do with size and everything to do with heart. Rodriguez moved like a shadow among the rocks, using every piece of cover the mountainside offered. Her small frame allowed her to slip through spaces that would have trapped larger soldiers, weaving between boulders and following natural depressions in the terrain. Enemy gunfire still echoed from the village, but she had learned to distinguish between shots fired in anger and those aimed with deadly precision. The route to the SEAL team's position took her through a maze of rocky passages and ancient terraces that local farmers had carved into the mountainside centuries ago. Each step required careful consideration, as loose stones could create avalanches that would reveal her position to enemy spotters. Rodriguez had studied topographical maps of the region until she could navigate by memory, but maps couldn't capture the reality of moving through a combat zone under enemy fire. 20 minutes into her solo movement, Rodriguez reached the village's outer buildings. The structures were typical of rural Afghanistan, built from local stone and designed to withstand the harsh mountain weather. What the builders hadn't anticipated was modern warfare, and bullet holes peppered the walls like deadly confetti. She could hear Morrison's team calling for support from somewhere deeper in the village. Moving from building to building required patience and timing that most soldiers never developed. Rodriguez had to wait for enemy fighters to reload or shift position before exposing herself to cross open spaces. Her heart pounded with each dash between cover points, but her breathing remained controlled. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford when Morrison's life hung in the balance. The first wounded SEAL she encountered was barely conscious, clutching his rifle despite a shattered shoulder that had soaked his uniform with blood. Rodriguez quickly assessed his injuries while keeping watch for enemy movement. The shoulder wound was serious, but not immediately life-threatening if properly treated. She applied pressure bandages and administered pain medication, whispering reassurance while her hands worked with practiced efficiency. The young SEAL tried to protest when Rodriguez insisted on moving him to better cover, arguing that he could still fight. She ignored his objections with the authority that came from medical training and combat experience. Wounded soldiers often couldn't judge their own condition accurately, and Rodriguez had seen too many heroes die because they refused to acknowledge their limitations. Finding Morrison required navigating deeper into the village, past buildings where enemy fighters had established defensive positions. Rodriguez could hear their voices calling to each other in languages she didn't recognize, coordinating their response to the American assault. The sound of boots on stone and the metallic clicks of weapons being reloaded created a deadly symphony that guided her movement. She found Morrison in a narrow alley between two buildings, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound that had already soaked the ground beneath him. Two other SEALs crouched nearby, returning fire when they could, but primarily focused on protecting their leader. Rodriguez immediately went to work, checking Morrison's pulse and breathing while assessing the extent of his injuries. The head wound was worse than initially reported, with blood loss that had already weakened Morrison's vital signs. Rodriguez cleaned and dressed the wound as best she could under combat conditions, but Morrison needed surgery and blood transfusion that weren't available in an Afghan mountain village. She radioed their position and medical status to her unit, knowing that extraction remained impossible while enemy fire controlled the approaches to the village. What happened next would be debated in military circles for years afterward. Morrison regained consciousness as Rodriguez finished treating his wound, his eyes focusing with difficulty on her face. He tried to sit up, his warrior's instincts telling him to rejoin the fight despite his condition. Rodriguez pushed him back down with surprising strength, her voice carrying an authority that transcended rank or gender. The enemy attack intensified as reinforcements arrived from other parts of the mountain. Rodriguez found herself trapped with 3 wounded SEALs in a position that was becoming increasingly untenable. Air support remained limited due to the enemy's use of civilian structures, and friendly ground forces couldn't advance through the concentrated gunfire that swept the village's approaches. Rodriguez made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her background. She radioed her unit and informed them that she was preparing to carry Morrison out of the village on foot. The response was immediate and negative, with Williams ordering her to wait for organized extraction. But Rodriguez had seen too many good soldiers die while waiting for perfect solutions to imperfect problems. Morrison weighed nearly twice what Rodriguez did, his gear and equipment adding another 50 pounds to his unconscious form. Basic physics suggested that carrying him 8 miles through mountain terrain was beyond her physical capabilities. But Rodriguez had built her entire military career on proving that basic assumptions about women in combat were often wrong. She rigged an improvised stretcher from equipment and debris, distributing Morrison's weight in a way that would allow her to drag rather than carry him initially. The other 2 wounded SEALs provided covering fire as she began the extraction, their rifles sending measured shots toward enemy positions while conserving ammunition for the long journey ahead. The first mile was the most dangerous, as enemy fighters could still observe and engage Rodriguez as she moved Morrison through the village outskirts. She had to stop frequently to return fire or wait for enemy attention to focus elsewhere. Morrison drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes trying to help by moving his legs, but more often dead weight that tested Rodriguez's strength and determination. Clear of the village, Rodriguez faced the reality of carrying a gravely wounded man through 8 miles of mountain terrain without immediate support. The improvised stretcher worked for smooth ground, but became unwieldy on the rocky slopes and narrow paths that characterized the region. She made the decision to shift Morrison onto her back, using a technique she had learned from studying how native porters carried heavy loads in similar terrain. The physical challenge was unlike anything Rodriguez had faced in training or combat. Each step sent shooting pains through her legs and back as Morrison's weight compressed her spine. Her breathing became labored within the first hour, but she maintained a steady pace that would conserve energy for the long journey ahead. Stopping for rest wasn't an option, as Morrison's medical condition continued to deteriorate with each passing hour. Rodriguez's radio provided updates on the tactical situation as she climbed higher into the mountains. Her unit was advancing toward the village, but meeting heavy resistance. Air support had arrived, but couldn't provide close support without risking civilian casualties. The extraction helicopter remained grounded due to enemy surface-to-air threats that made flying too dangerous. 3 miles into the journey, Morrison's condition worsened significantly. He began showing signs of severe shock, his breathing becoming shallow and irregular. Rodriguez administered the last of her 4 fluids while calculating how much farther they had to travel. Her own physical condition was deteriorating as well, with muscle cramps and dehydration beginning to affect her judgment and coordination. The mountain path became increasingly treacherous as afternoon shadows lengthened into evening. Rodriguez had to navigate by memory and instinct, as using a flashlight would reveal their position to any enemy forces that might be pursuing. Morrison's weight seemed to increase with each step, and Rodriguez found herself stumbling more frequently as fatigue overwhelmed her determination. But quitting wasn't in her vocabulary, and Morrison's life depended entirely on her ability to keep moving. Rodriguez drew on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, fueled by the knowledge that a fellow soldier's survival rested on her shoulders. The physical pain became secondary to the moral imperative of bringing Morrison home alive. The 4th mile marked a turning point where Rodriguez's body began to rebel against the impossible task she had undertaken. Her legs shook with each step, and her vision blurred from exhaustion and dehydration. Morrison's weight had redistributed awkwardly, causing sharp pains in her shoulders and neck that threatened to buckle her knees. But she could hear his breathing, irregular and weak, but still there, and that sound kept her moving forward. The mountain path wound through a series of switchbacks that added distance, but provided easier grades for climbing. Rodriguez used the terrain to her advantage, resting Morrison against rocky outcrops when she needed to adjust his position or check his vital signs. His pulse remained weak, but steady, and the bleeding from his head wound had finally stopped. Her field treatment was holding, but he needed proper medical care soon. By the 5th mile, Rodriguez was operating on pure willpower and military discipline. Her water ran out an hour earlier, and her body was consuming muscle mass for energy. She had removed all non-essential gear to reduce weight, keeping only her rifle, ammunition, and medical supplies. Every ounce mattered when carrying a man nearly twice her size through terrain that challenged experienced climbers even without additional loads. The radio crackled with updates from her unit, who were making progress through the village but still hours away from reaching the extraction point. William's voice came through periodically, offering encouragement and tactical updates. He had ordered a medical team to the landing zone, but they couldn't deploy until Rodriguez reached the designated coordinates with Morrison. As darkness fell, Rodriguez faced new challenges that tested her navigation skills and mental toughness. The mountain paths became harder to distinguish from natural rock formations, and the risk of walking off a cliff increased dramatically. She relied on memory and intuition to follow routes she had studied on maps, but never traveled at night. One wrong turn could add hours to the journey or lead them into impassable terrain. Morrison stirred more frequently during the 6th mile, sometimes mumbling incoherently about mission objectives or calling out the names of his team members. Rodriguez tried to keep him calm, while maintaining her pace, explaining their situation and progress when his consciousness allowed comprehension. His awareness of their predicament seemed to motivate him to help, and he began trying to support some of his own weight during brief periods of alertness. The 7th mile brought Rodriguez to the edge of complete physical breakdown. Her legs could barely support her own weight, much less Morrison's additional mass. She fell repeatedly, each time struggling to get back up while protecting Morrison from additional injury. Her hands were bloody from gripping rocks for support, and her uniform was torn from sliding against stone surfaces. But Rodriguez could see the landing zone in the distance, a flat area marked by chemical lights that her unit had placed for helicopter navigation. The sight gave her a final surge of energy, the promise that Morrison would receive proper medical care, and that her impossible mission was nearly complete. She adjusted his position one final time and began the last descent towards safety. The sound of helicopter rotors reached them before Rodriguez could see the aircraft. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of military helicopters meant that medical evacuation was standing by, waiting for her to deliver Morrison to the landing zone. The noise grew louder as she stumbled down the final slope, her legs giving way repeatedly, but her determination carrying her forward. Rodriguez reached the landing zone as the medical helicopter touched down, its rotor wash creating a dust storm that obscured everything beyond a few feet. Medics rushed toward her with a proper stretcher, their experienced hands taking Morrison's weight and transferring him to professional care. Rodriguez collapsed beside the aircraft, her mission finally complete after 8 miles of impossible terrain and superhuman effort. The medical team worked on Morrison while Rodriguez received her own treatment for exhaustion, dehydration, and the numerous cuts and bruises she had accumulated during the journey. For fluids and oxygen helped restore her strength, but it would be days before she fully recovered from the physical ordeal. Morrison was stabilized and flown to a forward surgical team, where doctors confirmed that Rodriguez's field treatment had likely saved his life. Word of Rodriguez's feat spread quickly through military channels and eventually reached the media. The story of a small female soldier carrying a wounded SEAL 8 miles through enemy territory captured public imagination and challenged preconceptions about women in combat roles. But Rodriguez was uncomfortable with the attention, insisting that any soldier would have done the same thing in her position. Morrison recovered fully from his injuries and returned to active duty with his SEAL team. He made a point of publicly acknowledging Rodriguez's actions, crediting her with saving not only his life, but the lives of his wounded team members who might have died waiting for conventional extraction. Their friendship became a symbol of military brotherhood that transcended gender and service branch distinctions. The mission itself was eventually classified as a tactical success despite the intelligence failures that led to the ambush. Enemy forces were eliminated, and valuable intelligence was recovered from the village. But military analysts focused more on the lessons learned about small unit tactics and the importance of having medically trained personnel with frontline units. Rodriguez received multiple commendations for her actions, including a Bronze Star Medal with Valor Device for heroism under enemy fire. She was promoted ahead of schedule and offered opportunities to attend advanced military schools. But she chose to remain with her unit, continuing to serve as a combat medic while training other soldiers in mountain warfare techniques. The physical challenges Rodriguez faced during those 8 miles became the subject of military studies about human performance under extreme conditions. Sports medicine experts and military researchers analyzed her technique for carrying Morrison, developing new training protocols for casualty evacuation in difficult terrain. Her achievement expanded understanding of what was possible when training, determination, and necessity combined. Years later, Rodriguez would reflect on that night as the moment when her military career truly began. Everything before had been preparation, and everything after was built on the confidence that came from proving herself under the ultimate test. She had answered the question about whether women belonged in combat, not with words, but with actions that spoke louder than any argument. Morrison kept in touch with Rodriguez throughout their military careers and beyond, their shared experience creating a bond that transcended normal military relationships. He often spoke about how Rodriguez's determination inspired him during his own recovery and influenced his leadership style with other young SEALs. Their story became part of military folklore, told and retold in training schools and deployment briefings. The mountains of Afghanistan continued to challenge American forces for years after Rodriguez's heroic journey. But her achievement provided a template for what was possible when soldiers refused to accept limitations imposed by others' expectations. Her example influenced military policy discussions about women in combat and demonstrated that physical capability couldn't be measured by traditional metrics alone. Rodriguez eventually retired from active duty after 20 years of service, but she remained connected to the military community through veteran organizations and speaking engagements. Her story continued to inspire new generations of soldiers who faced their own doubts about whether they were strong enough, brave enough, or capable enough to serve their country with distinction. The 8 miles Rodriguez carried Morrison through the Afghan mountains represented more than just a physical achievement. It was a demonstration of the warrior spirit that had defined American military service for generations, proving that heroism came in all sizes and that courage was measured not by physical strength, but by the willingness to sacrifice everything for fellow soldiers. Her legacy lived on in every soldier who refused to quit when the mission seemed impossible.